And hello, fabulous students. This is your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I am excited to be with you today. Today, we are talking about the New South. After Reconstruction, so the Civil War is over. Then we have the attempts of Reconstruction, right? And the effects of all that. So, what emerges as a result of the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction? What does the South look like? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let us begin. All right. So with the South, now having been lost the Civil War, and they're sort of being forced back into the Union, then there's a lot of economic opportunity that happens. And so we're going to start seeing a lot of things being promoted for the South, like a self-sufficient economy. They want to build it on capitalist values. Um, they want to improve the transportation, the improve race relations. Henry Grady is an editor of the Atlanta Constitution, and he spread the gospel of the New South, and he was basically saying, we need to make them economically prosperous through laissez-faire capitalism. So you're going to start seeing many businesses from the north are going to start investing in the south. You're going to see major industries in the south arise, like Alabama's going to get be known for its steel production throughout the country. Memphis is going to be known for lumber, and Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy at one point, will be known as the tobacco leading tobacco industry for the country. So we're gonna see a lot of, like I said, investment happening in the South. One thing the South did not do well with, and it kind of hurt them in the Civil War, was they just didn't have a lot of transportation. Like it was easier to transport um, supplies and troops and all that in the North because they just had better infrastructure. So a lot of money is going to be going into making the South uh, more free in its transportation to get from point A to point B, and for commerce and economics and all that, right? So you're going to see a lot of northern investors, and they're going to start investing a lot of money in the South. 75% of the southern railroads will be owned by northern investors, and by 1900 they'll have control of the South steel industry as well. So the North is going to capitalize on the South needing to be basically brought up to speed, modernized, if you will. And the South does, for the most part, they want modernization because they do want to be competitive. But we're going to see northern businesses and all the money that, I shouldn't say all the money, but a lot of the money that gets generated from the revenue in the South is just going to make it up to northern banks, and won't stay in the South per se. So anyway, but it's going to lead to a lot of economic opportunities. Okay, the South, remember, didn't invest in technical or engineering schools for white or black residents as the North had done, but slowly those things are going to change, and we're going to see Southern industrial workers earn about half the natural rate wage and work longer hours than did workers elsewhere. So it's not great in the South, but they're going in the right direction. So agriculture and poverty, as far as economics, are going the right direction. Let's make sure we're clear on that. So agriculture and poverty are a major issue. Okay, so we have a lot of people, a lot of freed black slaves living in the South, right? So what does that look like? How do they support their families? How do they live? So one way that got very popular by 1900 was half of the region's white farmers and three-fourths of the black farmers were either tenant farmers who rented land. They weren't landowners. They didn't own the farm, but they rented it, or they were sharecroppers. And what that means is they would pay for the use of the land, and then they would be the one to plant it and everything, and then the person who owned the land they would split the profits, um, and that was called sharecropping. So those were the two ways. This was for white farmers and black farmers in the South, and it wasn't typically great. There was a lot of advantage being taken by the people who were sharecropping. So bank loans were hard to get, especially in the South, since they're suffering economically. So anywhere where there's economic turmoil, bank loans are going to be hard to get because banks don't want to give out money because they're afraid they give out that money and it's going to be a bad investment. They're not going to get it back, right? So this just made it harder for farmers to get a loan and to buy property and to have their own harvest and their own land and their own property. So the combination of sharecropping and crop liens kept farmers as virtual serfs tied to the land by debt. With the South ramping up their cotton industry, this flooded the cotton supply globally, resulting in 50% decline of cotton by 1890. So here we have again, the South is king cotton, right? But every other place they went to, when the Civil War hit, um, you know, England and other places in Europe, they went to other places like Egypt or India to get their cotton. So now the South is ramping up their cotton industry, but they're in essence they're now flooding it because people had already come up with new avenues to secure cotton from other places. So because they flooded the industry of cotton, now the value of cotton's going to go down. So the farmers and the plantations in the South, they're really they're having a hard time getting off the ground and to getting the southern regions to be more prosperous economically. You have a man by the name of George Washington Carver. He's a scientist, and what he's going to do is he's going to promote the growing of such crops as like peanuts, sweet potatoes, soybeans. He's going to say, let's get away from tobacco and let's get away from cotton and let's start planting other things and let's be a little more diverse. And so peanuts would be a very popular thing in the South. This work played an important role in shifting Southern agriculture towards a more diverse base. So you're going to have attempts to organize here, right? So we're going to see farmers starting to sort of come together. As in the North and the West, hard times produced a harvest of discontent. So you have the South there kind of being discontent with the way situation things are. You have people in the far West and even parts of the North. So a separate organization for African Americans, the Colored Farmers National Alliance, had about 250,000 members by this time period after Reconstruction and into this idea of New South, right? So between 1865 to 1890 or somewhere in there. So both organizations rallied behind political reforms to solve the farmers' economic problems. If poor black and poor white farmers in the South, if they could have just united, they could have been a very powerful political force, but again, racial attitudes stood in that way. So they continued both these groups continued to get taken advantage of. And then you have in the South these Democratic politicians who 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 become redeemers, right? And they're going to redeem the South and bring it back to what its glory was. And and a lot of these redeemers were white supremacists. So that's going to lead to further persecution and to the eventual segregation of what we learn in the South with like Jim Crow laws. Um, Plessy versus Ferguson will also be another one, which will encourage these separations or segregations between the two groups or races. Uh, these supremacists favor treating African Americans as social inferiors by separating, segregating in public facilities by race. The Redeemers often use race to deflect the real concerns of tenant farmers and the poor. And so, if you think about this, I mean, even today, it kind of feels like, you know, one political trick can be to, when there's major economic problems happening in the country, well, let's point our finger towards something else and get the people more focused on that and then on the actual root problem. And so they're gonna race bait a lot, okay? Um, in the South. During Reconstruction, federal laws protected African Americans from discrimination by local and state governments. However, the Supreme Court is going to strike some of these laws down. In the civil rights case of 1888, the court ruled that Congress could not ban racial discrimination practiced by a private citizen or business, including railroads, hotels, and that they use for by the public. So what this court ruling is going to eventually do is it's going to basically lead to a cascade of laws that will be known as the Jim Crow laws. And these will, have laws such as requiring separate bathrooms or separate water fountains, etc. And that's going to go on for, let's see here, nearly a century. Um, okay, so we have, okay, so laws were also being passed to stifle black votes. So you have laws literally being passed to stop black people in the South from having that voice at the ballot box. So in Louisiana, you have 130,334 black voters who registered in 1896, but by 1904, there were 1,342. I mean, that's a massive decline, right? So they specifically put laws in place to make it so they could not vote. You have literacy tests, you have poll taxes happening, you had grandfather clauses also coming into play. Um, and so these laws are being passed specifically to silence the black population in the South. You have lynch mobs that are being that are rising up, and 1,400 black men are going to be killed by these lynch mobs in 1890. You have economic discrimination happening, and you have like the skilled labor jobs, those are going to go more towards like the immigrants and the white South, the poor white and the immigrant South, Southern population, and they're going to, keep the African Americans mainly within the farming and low paying domestic work. So responding to segregation, right? So Ida B. Wells is going to be a vocal protagonist that's going to say this is wrong. She's going to get to the point where she's going to even be persecuted. She'll have her own printing press being destroyed, which is then going to make her realize that she needs to move to the north if she's going to continue to have a voice. She felt like it was dangerous continue living where she was and move further north. Others advocating leaving the South or even the entire country. You have Bishop Henry Turner, and he's going to form the International Migration Society, which is going to be a society that helps black Southerners or just black African Americans, we'll say just African Americans, if they want to immigrate to Africa and go back basically to the homeland or whatever, then they have that option. Many black families moved to Kansas and Oklahoma and the places where it was new for the westward expansion. You have a man by the name of Booker T. Washington. He kind of takes a pretty interesting approach. He was born enslaved. He graduated from the Hampton Institute. He's going to focus less on the political aspect and the social inequality. What he really wants to try to do is he wants to make it so black people in the South will be able to get out of poverty. That's the big thing. He wants them to get out of poverty, and to do that, they need to have skills and they need to learn things and be able to go to college and institutes and trade centers, and That's the key for him. He wants to preach virtues of hard work and moderation and economic sufficiency. He believes that they have more power in having a little green ballot, which he says when you earn money, it gives you a little green ballot, and he says, and that's even more powerful at times than a political ballot. So he wants them to get out of um, bondage, if you will, financial bondage, and to be self-sufficient. So he comes up with the idea called the Atlanta Compromise. And this is the belief that black and white Southerners, they share a similar responsibility. They're trying to make the South prosper once again, right? So he's urging black people to focus on working hard at their jobs and not challenging segregation or discrimination. He's not necessarily concerned about the political aspect. He realizes that they're very, very different. He said, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So his attitude is going to be very different, but a lot of people in Washington are going to like what he says because he's basically trying to say, look, don't try and change the social aspect. Let's just get you making money. Okay? So it's all about economic cooperation, which a lot of people like Andrew Carnegie and President Theodore Roosevelt, they like. Okay. He's also going to start an organization known as the National Negro Business League, and anyway, it'll have a big impact on helping African Americans have um, have trading skills that can make them competitive somewhat in the workforce. Okay, so we also have some responses to Washington here and what's going on. Um, so you got civil rights leaders that are going to start popping up. They're going to start speaking out, having a voice. One civil rights leader is a young African American leader. His name is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he is going to demand an end to segregation and the granting of equal civil rights to all Americans. In contrast, all writers praise Washington for paving the way for black self reliance because of his emphasis on starting and supporting black owned businesses. So you got Booker T. Washington, you got W.E.B. Du Bois, you got I.D.B. Wells. You have all these voices that are starting to speak up. They don't all agree, they might all have different nuances to their arguments, but in the end, they're all trying to improve the way of life for the African American, especially those in the South. So change is going to come slowly to the region. They're going to want to change, cling to the past. The white supremacy and segregation would continue to dominate race relations in the South until civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. The Southern economy would finally achieve the vision of the New South after World War II, as it shared in the prosperity of the post-war era. And that's it. So go ahead and write your summary, and we'll discuss this when we return. Thanks.